How's it going, everyone? In this video, I'm going to be doing a book review of Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. So Never Split the Difference is best for those who have some experience with negotiation and also want to get some extra tools and tips from someone who was a FBI negotiator for a number of years. Difficulty to digest. Never Split the Difference is very conversational. There's a lot of stories. The reading really pulls you along. So anybody should be able to get through it without any real problems. Key insights. So, Never Split the Difference is basically the culmination of Chris Voss's experience as an FBI negotiator. Accordingly, he goes through a mix of stories and tactics and other ideas and kind of pulls them all together to build the full picture of everything he's experienced and what has worked for him. The points are relatively straightforward and easy to digest, but there is a little bit of exposition, so don't expect, a play-by-play for negotiation. Never Split the Difference is basically broken out into a couple pieces. This doesn't go exactly with the chapter headings, but it's kind of my read on how I went through it and how I break it up. The first major section or idea is creating comfort. And Voss goes over a bunch of different ways that you can make the other person that you're negotiating with feel a lot more comfortable and feel like you're really on their side. This goes down to a couple different tactics, including mirroring, labeling, empathetic listening, and some others. So one of the biggest themes here is to slow down the conversation. You can do this by asking questions or empathizing with the other person, or basically just showing that you've been listening. And this allows the other person to feel heard, which lowers the emotional response, making it easier to negotiate. Because a lot of times what happens in failed negotiations is there's a really high level of emotion and two people building that on each other to the point where they can no longer reach an agreement. So slowing the conversation down is a really powerful tool. Another thing that is emphasized is being very empathetic and acknowledging emotions, right? A lot of times people go into negotiations and only acknowledge the points, but don't actually acknowledge the emotions that the other person is feeling. So Voss recommends using a technique called labeling and basically just calling out, it seems like you're frustrated. These kinds of things to, again, make space to dissolve some of the emotional content and that way allow you to focus on more of the actual detailed nuances of the negotiation. Now, once you've kind of resolved some of the emotional problems, Never Split the Difference talks about creating an environment where you can move into the tactical details. And one of the major themes is that instead of looking for yes, you want to find the first set of no's, because generally no's are what bounds the parameters of the negotiation, right? It kind of shows what is likely to work and what's not. Once you start hitting some no's, you know kind of the edges of what the other person is comfortable with and can start negotiating from there. Another key point that's brought up is to listen for subtle hints whether or not they're on board with you. So one of the big examples is you're right versus that's right. If someone's saying you're right, that means internally they haven't necessarily gotten on board. But if they say that's right, that means that it's a situation or a piece of information or a framing that they agree with. So just looking at these little pieces can give you a better idea of where the person is in the negotiation. The big main point, though, for kind of creating comfort is to leave the conversation open, leave a lot of space for the other person to share information with you. Because the more information you have, the better able you are to figure out an optimal solution that works for both people. You don't want to make the other person feel like they're backed into a corner, because that's when you start getting the emotions to raise, and then it's a lot harder to negotiate from there. Now, the second major piece that I pulled out of this book is kind of executing the deal, right? Once you have those emotional components in check, the details can become the sticking point. And one of the best things that you can do to make sure that the details actually come together and things actually execute are to go through the steps of the solution and make sure that the other person is on board. So he recommends really putting the ball in their court and saying things like, how can I make this happen? Or how do you expect me to do that? That way they help you come up with the details of the solution. Another important point is to make sure that you're getting genuine buy-in. Going back to the you're right versus that's right, you need to know that they're on board with the plan and the details. And you need to go through the actual details, because what can happen is as you push further down the line, or as you get into actually executing, things can come up that derail the deal because there's some detail that was overlooked. So you want to make sure that you are able to really iron out exactly what's going to happen. Another thing is to move the conversation away from I feel like, or I want, or I, into it seems like territory, right? You're moving away from your feelings towards the situation and the solutions. That way it becomes more about solving a problem and less about your interpersonal kind of relationship. Of course, you want to make them feel good and heard, but you don't want to come across as like, I'm being managed by my feelings, I am negotiating out of feelings. You want to look at the situation and focus on how you can solve it. The last major section or theme I pulled out of the book was negotiating to win. And in this couple set of chapters, it seems like Voss takes a more aggressive approach and uses more of his FBI background, right? So there's some things that you should probably take with a grain of salt. Pay attention to when you may or may not want to use these strategies, because they may not serve you in all situations. Now, one of the points that Voss brings up is that negotiations are fairly arbitrary in terms of timeline, what's fair, things like that. So you can use things like a deadline to create more pressure to try to get someone to act, or you can do things like look for other solutions besides what's on the board, right? So for example, if you're just talking about money, you may want to try and dig out some more information from the other party about things that they care about, because you may be able to take another path that's not directly, oh, I want to pay $100, well, I'll offer 50, well, maybe 95, right? Like there are other ways that you can be flexible and kind of open up other paths in the negotiation. Another recommended tactic is, whenever possible, having the other person go first. Voss maintains that having more information is an advantage. So anytime that you can get the other person to go first, it gives you more information and lets you kind of use a little bit more leeway in the types of things that you offer in return. Once someone has staked their position, you now know at least a baseline. But that goes back to another tactic that he mentions, which is anchoring, which is basically setting a price that's either way higher or way lower than you expect, so that the other person feels like when you are able to negotiate or change from that. A few other things that Voss recommends are trying to use people's psychology against them, right? People tend to be averse to loss, so he recommends kind of framing some of the situations as like, well, I'm going to walk away from this if you don't budge on this thing or have this type of change in the agreement. So that's one of the things that can work against you or for you, depending on what the situation is, and you need to read the scenario a little bit. Finally, one of the big themes that Voss likes to focus on is the idea of a black swan, which in this book, in this context, is basically an idea or a piece of information that you can find or dig up that really gives you a lot of leverage. This is the extra piece of information that you can get from being open and negotiating and talking and discussing that allows you to find a really substantially useful deal and make the most of it. So he, above all, recommends being flexible and open and just figuring out what kind of information you can find. Final opinion. So Never Split the Difference is a pretty easy read, but I really only recommend it for those who have some other experience in negotiation tactics. This is mainly because Voss is coming from the perspective of an FBI agent, and some of the tactics that he recommends may or may not be useful for average everyday life. Not everyone is going to be in the same kinds of situations, and there may be other impacts that you don't have when you're negotiating in an FBI context. Other considerations. So some of the framing and tone can be a bit aggressive or just dismissive in general. For example, he refers to win-win as win-wimp. That's kind of a framework, this win-win idea that has helped a lot of people negotiate a little bit better. So for him to just kind of out of hand dismiss it and look down upon it is a little bit I would say just demeaning, right? There's no reason to really do that, to really frame it in that way. But he definitely comes from a more aggressive approach. And he even goes into that, saying there's, different ways to negotiate and that he's on the more aggressive end. Another thing that can come across is the book can feel a bit self-congratulatory. There's a lot of just really self-hype. While Voss is no doubt accomplished, it can be a little bit grating depending on the types of information that you generally like to assume and the personalities that you are impressed by or like to listen to. At face value, again, touting your accomplishments is not a necessarily bad thing, but it can just come across as a bit demeaning or on the aggressive end or on the boisterous end. And if you're sensitive to that, it may be something that you don't enjoy. The last piece is there are a couple tactics that seem a little dubious for average day-to-day use. For example, he mentions intentionally telling your negotiating partner something wrongly so that they can correct you and feel more comfortable. This directly contradicts other pieces where he's saying you should really do your best to be empathetic and show that you understand the other person. I suppose there is a way to do this where you leave the conversation open and leave it very light and approachable, but then intentionally say something wrong and then let them correct you. But to me, it just seems subversive in a way that doesn't really serve your goals in general. Though, just take some of these tactics with a grain of salt and consider how you might use them and how they might change your reputation. Because I imagine FBI negotiations aren't typically built out of building a reputation with the other party, whereas average day-to-day interactions you may have to deal with reputational consequences. So that's one extra caveat to think about that I don't think is very strongly hit upon in this book and may have been overlooked. All in all, it's a fairly good book. It just is really clear that Voss was an FBI negotiator, right? And some of the things that he sees or recommends may or may not apply to your average everyday life. For example, he says something along the lines of, everyone is always trying to take advantage of you. Well, when you're negotiating in the FBI, there is almost definitely certainty to that phrase. However, in normal life, that may or may not be true depending on the context and where you are. And blanket statements like that tend to put you into sort of like a defensive or aggressive mindset when interacting with others, which may or may not serve you well. I think it's just important to keep in mind what his background is, his history, his skill set. Again, no doubt that he's extremely good at what he does. It's just you need to pay attention to what pieces actively apply to the kind of life that you have. Since the content is delivered through such a specific frame, I recommend this more of a secondary piece of reading as opposed to a primary primer on how to learn about negotiation. So on to the reflection questions. 1. How well do you create comfort during negotiations in your life? 2. What tone do you usually use when negotiating? 3. What part of negotiation feels most difficult to you? How can you become stronger in that area? That's all I've got for this video, so hopefully it gives you a better understanding or idea of what Never Split the Difference is about. That's all I've got for this video, so as always, if you have any questions, comments, topics you want me to cover, put them down in the box below and I'll get to them as soon as I can, and I will see you next time.
You can check out more content at howtohappy.com. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you can stay up to date on the videos. We've also got a Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook that you can check out. Reflect, take action, and enjoy life. See you next time.